It's been an interesting couple of months over here at Nobody Should Believe Me. After season 6 aired, a case that we're still very much following, I wasn't quite sure where to go next. The Colin McDaniel story took a lot out of all of us, and as much as I love making this show, it can be emotionally grueling. And there are, unfortunately, no shortage of cases I could dive into at any given moment, with multiple high-profile lawsuits around the country and my inbox piling up with bizarre and horrific stories. People frequently ask me how I find the stories on the show, but the reality is, at this point, they mostly find me. And lately, with everything happening, we've felt like a mini newsroom over here. And several of the stories in the headlines have brought us back to a familiar voice.
I am a pediatrician and also a board-certified child abuse pediatrician, and I was essentially accused of all kinds of things in evaluating Maya Kowalski for allegations of child abuse. In her case, it was medical child abuse or Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Maya happened to get admitted to Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital in October of 2016. And I did a medical evaluation for her under the Child Protection Team.
Dr. Sally Smith has been villainized in a torrent of media coverage over the past several years, most notably in the Netflix film Take Care of Maya, which was viewed by millions of people. We've stayed in touch since I first interviewed Sally 2 years ago, and we've been back on the mic with her for our new season. So naturally, I wanted to hear how she's feeling in the wake of recent events.
Decisions were made in court that resulted in an enormous finding of financial liability for Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital, and they appealed it on multiple grounds, and they just won their appeal. And it was very helpful in terms of reinforcing that people who are trying to keep children safe and evaluate them for possible child abuse and neglect, not only in Florida, but across the country, are protected from liability as long as they're acting in good faith. And the appeals court essentially found that both Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital and I were acting under our responsibilities under Florida statute regarding a child where there was serious concern for child abuse, and that we can't be held to some $200+ million, judgment over essentially everybody doing their job and following the orders of the dependency court in the case.
Yeah, I mean, so we had Ethan Shapiro on, and he talked to us through this verdict, and it was quite a strong opinion that the 3 justices wrote from the appellate court. And really the essence of it was not only reversing the verdict, but saying that this should never have gone to trial. And that the
Correct.
reason that this went to trial was because of an error, a series of errors on behalf of a series of errors on behalf of the trial court and Judge Carroll that misinterpreted the law. So this was quite a strong ruling in terms of, again, yes, upholding mandatory reporting laws and protections for people who are participating in the system that they are legally required to participate in. So before we get into kind of what this verdict means and how it could possibly sort of affect the mood in terms of doctors who are tasked with this duty of care, how did you feel when you heard this news?
I felt like it was pretty strong vindication regarding, personally, my role in the case, where I don't know that it's ever been put into public record, but I reviewed thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of documents about this child and ended up producing a 45-page report delineating all of the different ways that there was evidence of medical child abuse in the case. And somehow I can get sued for saying that, doing my job. And then the other thing that I thought was really striking in the trial was there was a lot of testimony, including quote unquote expert Dr. Eli Neuberger, who has since died, talking about essentially gross malpractice on my part and no idea what I'm talking about medical child abuse, and totally assassinating my character and everything. All that was presented to the jury during the plaintiff's side of the case. And then when Johns Hopkins All Children's is trying to present their defense to the jury, the judge somehow determined that none of the information about the actual child abuse case was relevant in the jury's decision making. Which at the time, I mean, I was just dumbfounded. I couldn't understand how that was possible, that was a judge's decision. And, I didn't see any way, and as it turned out, it played out in that manner, that there could be some kind of fair assessment of all the information in the case under the trial circumstances. And I honestly wasn't terribly surprised by the verdict because of these errors that were made by the judge, and the appeals court delineated those pretty clearly, that there was a lot of information that was presented to the jury that should never have been presented and was inflammatory, and sort of directed them down this path of some kind of egregious behavior and things beyond the pale of society and things. And I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous in my view. So I was pretty happy that the appeals court agreed that was the case.
Your former employer, Suncoast, had actually already settled out of court with the Kowalskis. And right. Now hospitals and other entities, other businesses settling lawsuits, it's pretty routine because it can be a way to save millions of dollars otherwise right. That could be spent in court. However, I think it's really important for listeners to know that that was not a decision that you made personally to settle with the
Absolutely
Kowalskis,
not.
And it wasn't one that you wanted. Yeah.
I almost refused to sign it, but I didn't think I had essentially the legal standing to do that.
If you want the full scoop on what happened with Maya Kowalski, you can listen to the jillion episodes I did on it in our 3rd season. But importantly for this conversation, the thousands of pages of court records from the lawsuit show an escalating pattern of medical child abuse. This culminated with Beata Kowalski demanding that Johns Hopkins All Children's give her daughter a massive amount of ketamine, and when they refused, threatening to take her home and put her on hospice so she could finally die. Beata, who was an infusion nurse who had previously administered ketamine and other drugs to her daughter through her central line, threatened to just give her the ketamine herself if the hospital wouldn't. There is exhaustive evidence of Maya's abuse and the threat her mother posed to her, but you'd never know any of that from the media coverage of the case. Because, in another intriguing point of connection, before the Preventionist turned its sights on Dr. Debra Jenssen, Sally was the first doctor to get Dyan Neary. And I think actually the title of Dyan Neary's piece, as it aired in New York Magazine, and this is with the caveat that editors might have chosen this for her, but it certainly, I think, encapsulates what's in the piece. The title that this piece was published under was "What Happened to Maya Kowalski? When a 10-year-old girl complained of mysterious pain, a doctor suspected child abuse. How far would she go to prove it?"
She would review all the child's records and see if there was evidence of child abuse, and then, assess that. That would be what she would do.
Yeah, she would do her job. And, I believe very strongly, after having, again, spent so much time reviewing all the documentation, watching every minute of the trial, I really strongly believe that if it was not for your intervention and the intervention of the other doctors at Johns Hopkins, the Maya Kowalski would not be here.
I think that's a reasonable concern, for sure. in addition to the idea of the hospice thing and continuing to give her IV ketamine at home and things like that, another option was they were going to take her to Italy, where some other experimental treatment was going to be given. So, I mean, obviously your listeners are very familiar with a lot of these kinds of features of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, medical child abuse. And so there were numerous ways in which the child's safety was seriously at risk if she was allowed to have her mother continue to make her medical decisions.
I was reading this morning in thinking about this whole situation and Dyan Neary and her reporting on you and her reporting now that's coming out about Dr. Debra Jenssen. And I was remembering that you had sent me your exchange with the fact checker from New York Magazine. And there are no fewer than 30 points that you attempted to correct for the fact checker. Very few of those corrections made it into the final piece.
Right.
But I really found what you said at the outset of your email to the fact checker, who you're communicating with, affecting. And I wondered if you could read what you said at the outset of this email about your work and your history.
I do recall writing this. So I retired from Suncoast, the company that held the child protection team contract at the time, and the child protection team in July 2022 after serving the children in my community for 32 years. Over those 32 years, I was on call for children admitted to Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital 24/7, 365, unless I was out of the country, and provided thousands of medical evaluations for children with allegations of child abuse and or neglect. I saw dozens of children who were literally beaten to death. I saw hundreds of babies and children who were killed or maimed by abusive head trauma. I saw hundreds more babies and children who had multiple broken bones from abuse, including young infants with more than 20 fractures in different stages of healing. I saw numerous children with ruptured intestines and internal organs from abusive abdominal trauma, some of whom died. As difficult as it may have been to see so many abused and neglected children over so many years, other factors prompted my retirement, including repeated unfair, biased, slanted media reports, social media campaigns that resulted in thousands of threatening, obscenity-laced calls to the staff of my private pediatric practice, dozens of calls to my personal phone threatening to kill me and burn down my house, and ongoing attacks on my emotional health and personal safety. Responding to biased media reports has been impossible because I am ethically bound to protect and respect the privacy of the children for whom I have provided CPT medical evaluations. So I cannot give details regarding cases that would effectively counter much of the erroneous information that's been published about me and other child abuse pediatricians. I am so bound regardless of whether parents or attorneys or journalists have chosen to breach the children's confidentiality. Therefore, I have attempted to respond to the numerous inaccuracies in your email as best I can.
Yeah. And, the reason that struck me, number one, I think there have been over the past several years this series of attacks on child abuse pediatricians. And I will say, I listened to an interview with Gregory Anderson, who was the former lead attorney for the Kowalskis. He's been fired by the Kowalskis, but he was opining on the court decision. And he said something, and I'm paraphrasing here. He disagreed with the appellate decision, not surprisingly, but also said something to the tune of that he believes that these laws that protect mandatory reporters aren't good laws. I do think that there are people out there that really just don't support mandatory reporting and don't support protections for mandatory reporters. And I think that tends to be, in a lot of media, the quiet part that's not being said out loud. And I really think that this media coverage of child abuse pediatricians can best be understood as part of a campaign to overturn those laws. on behalf of people that do not think that parents' rights should be infringed upon and really don't believe that that children should have sort of individual rights that should be, protected by others in the community besides their parents. Mm. But I just, as a person who covers exclusively child abuse cases on my show, I feel like I really do understand the stakes. And I understand the stakes both ways, right? I understand, I think about all the time the unintended consequences that could happen of my reporting. Could this make the situation for the children worse in some way that I'm not anticipating? Could this make life harder? Something that I thought about so much in my reporting. Could this accidentally make life harder for parents that have legitimately sick children, right? Could this throw suspicion on these legitimate conditions, however rare? Could this throw suspicion on legitimate cases? And now I try very hard to make sure that those things don't happen. And I've gotten a lot of really wonderful feedback from, parents who have sick children over the years that it's actually helped them not be afraid of doctors because they've realized that, these, and I think that's another unintended consequence, right? Is just making communities afraid of the children's hospital. Do you think communities should be afraid of children's hospitals?
There's all kinds of flames being fanned as if, going to a Lehigh Valley facility is going to result in everyone having their children removed. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. So in terms of The Preventionist, you've listened to it.
I have.
First of all, I know you both worked in Florida for a while. Do you know Dr. Debra Jenssen?
I do.
Okay.
She is an outstanding child abuse pediatrician, and I think the chance that she came to some kind of incorrect conclusion certainly in the cases that are presented in The Preventionist and other, shows that have given airtime to these quote unquote, wrongly accused parents. They're not, approaching it, in my view, in good faith. They aren't presenting information. It's extremely one-sided. And then it's also completely ignoring any access that somebody might have to research a bit. And, with The Preventionist, Dyan Neary's talking about she's been working on this for 2 or 3 years. And, she wasn't able to, she was able to find out what the medical findings were in the child of Amanda, whatever her name
Sarnofsky.
is. Sarnofsky, for example. But rather than looking at that and talking to somebody about, hey, what are these findings indicative of? Could this have been some kind of an accident where this young infant fell out of a bassinet in some way? They could easily have found that the extent of the injuries in that child was far beyond what made any sense with the history. And so, in cases in the movie and things that I was involved with, there's all kinds of public record that somebody could have looked at that would have made it clear that, this person is saying this, that they were wrongly accused, but there's an awful lot of evidence that that's not the case. But they're instead portrayed in all kinds of reports over now 5, 6, 7 years that, the parent said this, and therefore that is the truth, which, is ridiculous. People don't come into emergency rooms and say, I kind of lost it and threw my kid on the floor. They tell other stories. And, a child abuse pediatrician, for example, in that scenario is left to look at what are the injuries that the child had and what kind of forces and scenarios and things would typically cause this severity of injury. And is there any way that what's being presented makes any kind of sense in a scientific, medical, physics kind of a sense. And they don't even, I mean, I understand Dyan Neary's not a scientist. She's a creative writing PhD. So maybe that's what our problem is. But to not even try to delve into the science further over multiple years. And she's talking about all of her staff that, spend all kinds of time researching. Well, what were they researching? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. And I want to talk a little bit in more detail about the Amanda Sarnofsky case and kind of what are some of the details that were left out. But I think before that, to your point, like nothing against creative writing majors. I also was a creative writing major. One can learn to be a journalist on the job. No offense. Yeah, I know. But, like you have to bring, as a person who is a novelist, who also now is working on this show, I bring a different skill set to both of those things, in one, you have to fact check. For the other one, you just get to make stuff up. So right. Anyway, I was struck after listening to these 3 episodes by what Neary came up with after spending 2 years with the resources of the New York Times on this story. And it really feels pretty surface to me. Like, do you see anything in this reporting that points to Dr. Jensen being especially overzealous or really just doing anything that, there are, and again, I think the lack of curiosity here is pretty stunning because there are protocols for evaluating abusive head trauma and evaluating Munchausen by proxy. And like, these are things that there is, there are consensus documents on, and like, it's not a mystery, right? It's like there's a way that child abuse pediatricians do their jobs. And I struggle from listening to this to identify, if you sort of screen out the noise of the lawsuit and the Pinsley report, which in my opinion should be screened out, right? Because they're not actually indicative of any wrongdoing of Dr. Jensen. You really have to dig a little deeper than that, not just present them. But if you screen out that noise, there isn't anything that they pointed to in this reporting that I heard that spoke to how differently Dr. Jensen does her job. Did you hear anything in this reporting that spoke to that?
No, because they don't really talk. It's not like they said, oh, she came in and she didn't talk to any of the doctors at the hospital, and she didn't look at any of the child's medical history, and she didn't look at any of the lab tests or any of the x-rays or any of the CAT scans or any of the follow-up information or any risk factors for the family or all the other things that child abuse pediatricians look at. She didn't try to think through whether there was a possibly accidental or alternative explanation besides child abuse. She just jumped to this conclusion. They have no evidence that they're presenting that was the problem. The problem, they're saying, is that once she identifies child abuse, she's overzealous about trying to keep the children safe. Well, frankly, I've been accused of the same thing by some of these same people. I don't apologize for being fairly zealous in trying to protect children who I think are in serious danger. So if that's some kind of a, act of malpractice on my part or some kind of evidence of my medical negligence or something like that, I'm not backing away just because, somebody is trying to intimidate me or other child abuse pediatricians to say that you might think there was something wrong here, but the mom says that there wasn't. And so you didn't do your job right, or you're acting outside of the typical realm and parameters of a child abuse pediatrician. It's ridiculous. I know Dr. Jensen. I know she approached complex cases in the same manner that I did, and was well-versed in specifics of radiology results associated with certain types of child abuse and patterns of inappropriate medical care associated with Munchausen syndrome by proxy cases. I never experienced any kind of interaction with her or any kind of, we did a lot of peer review, quality improvement kind of reviewing of other teams around the state. I was on that review team for years. Nobody ever said, hey, Dr. Jensen rashly diagnoses child abuse with no evidence. That's just not the situation here. Just because, some comptroller in Pennsylvania or some, mom who had multiple prior reports or investigations by DCF, said something different doesn't mean that Dr. Jensen didn't do her job appropriately.
I want to kind of zero in, and some of this is going to take, a bit more digging on this whole situation, which we are going to do a full season on, but I wanted to have some responsive reporting as this is coming out into the world. On like how should we what is the proper way to look at a child abuse pediatrician's work? Because it is different than other doctors, right?
Well, it's not really though, Andrea. Child abuse pediatricians take a history, do a physical exam, assess all of the ancillary data, and put all that together, consider a differential diagnosis in your brain, and then come up with a diagnosis and recommendations for a plan. That's exactly the same thing that doctors do in every scenario. So it's not really different. We have a different specialty than cardiology, sure, but we don't do anything different really.
Yeah, but you have a scarier name, so that's an important piece. No, that's a really good point, Sally. I asked Sally how doctors, including child abuse pediatricians, are evaluated if there are concerns about their work.
Ideally, what should happen is the same thing that happens when another doctor is accused of not doing their job properly or, causing some problem or being a bad endocrinologist or something, is that, it may be presented to Board of Professional Regulation or court or whatever the case may be. And then there are medical witnesses that come and delineate why this doctor's conduct or conclusions or whatever was unacceptable or incompetent or negligent or whatever the allegation is. And then, somebody looks at all these pieces of evidence and makes a decision about whether there's any validity to the accusation. But a lot of times in these cases, they're saying, oh, well, there should be a second opinion if there's a mandatory second opinion if there is a high-profile case or something. Well, interestingly enough, most of the cases that have been reported on regarding my evaluation of kids in Florida were reviewed, had a second opinion by the statewide medical director for the state of Florida, because that's how that system is set up. And they concurred with my diagnosis in all of those cases that were reviewed.
And actually, interestingly enough, Sally, that was the case in a case that we are going to talk about in this upcoming season, but that also made it into Dyan Neary's original article about you, which was the Viviana Graham case. That was also, I believe, I remember you telling me that abuse was confirmed by the statewide medical director in that case as well.
Exactly. And in Maya Kowalski's case, that was reviewed by, my report was reviewed by, and actually the whole pile of records was sent to the statewide medical director because it was fairly controversial even at the time that the case was going on. So the idea that a parent or an alleged perpetrator should be the one who picks the doctor to decide if a child abuse pediatrician did their job correctly is ludicrous. You don't get a pediatric cardiologist to evaluate whether an adult orthopedic surgeon did their job properly. And so what you have to have is a child abuse pediatrician. We're board certified, we're experts in this area, And especially if Serial and the New York Times and New York Magazine or whatever are saying, oh, no, we're not trying to put out all kinds of negative information about child abuse pediatricians. Oh, no, they're doing their job and it's great. And, somebody has to do that. And, oh, what a noble profession and everything. It's just these specific doctors over here. So if that's the case, then those specific doctors over here can be reviewed by other child abuse pediatricians. And if the other child abuse pediatrician says, oh, the evidence was all there, yeah, I would have to say I agree, then that needs to be the end of the case. Not that the parent gets to go out and hire some, person that is going to say the opposite. I mean, like Dyan Neary.
That's a whole cottage industry, which people may not recognize, right?
Oh,
I mean, you've got Dr. Richard Bowles, who is always is diagnosing mitochondrial disease. You've sort of got this list of doctors, and I'm going to get into that in the next season, that this is a list that gets shared amongst parents, right?
Right.
There are this sort of list of people who make very good money testifying in court. Dr. Eli Newberger was one, got paid over $100,000 to do a deposition, the deposition you mentioned in the Kowalski case. This is no small cottage industry of you can find a doctor to disagree with any decision.
Right. And the Kowalski case, I mean, it was presented to the jury as if Dr. Hanna and Dr. Kirkpatrick were on a par with all kinds of other pain management and CRPS doctors and things like that. Well, what about the guy from Stanford who said, what in the world were they doing? And, this was dangerous. And no, I wouldn't have given this amount of ketamine to anybody, let alone a 10-year-old child. So, that guy comes up and says those things, and then they still portray that, oh, this was very reasonable and there was no reason to be concerned about her safety or, things like that. It's disingenuous at best.
Yeah, and I think there really is a lot of mental gymnastics that go into making these cases look like something that they're not. And that, I think, in terms of journalistic integrity is really my big beef with it, right? Because this has real consequences and journalistic ethics matter for a reason. Many of the cases in The Preventionist aren't examined in any detail, and it's not clear what records families provided to the Serial team. They declined to answer that question when I reached out to them for comment. But the third episode follows the journey of a mother named Amanda Saranovsky, who was charged with abusing her 7-week-old baby and ended up pleading no contest to reckless endangerment of a person. Amanda claims the injuries were accidental. Here is her version of events as recounted on her lawyer's podcast, Legally at Law.
It was December 14th, approximately 5:30 in the morning, when I woke up to a thud on my floor. I woke up and I seen my 7-week-old on the floor and my 2-year-old in his bassinet. His onesie was zipped down, diaper was off. I looked at my 2-year-old and I asked her what happened and what did she do. I immediately called my sister. She didn't answer. I called the kid's father. He did not answer. I called their doctors, obviously. I mean, it was a weekend. And once the recording came on saying if it was an emergency to call 911, and that's what I did.
Amanda tells Dyan Neary this same version of events in The Preventionist. And it's an unusual story, so I wanted to get Sally's take. I wanted to sort of start with this piece about, it's a 7-week-old baby at the time. And she says, and apparently she told some conflicting versions of this to the paramedics and then later at the hospital, which is obviously...
They kind of left that out, didn't they?
They did. That was in the news reports, but that was left out. And I guess leaving, some recognition that this is a stressful situation and et cetera. But I mean, certainly telling a different story over time is certainly a red flag. And I just wanted to start with this story because, as I often find when I hear some of these narratives, I have really little kids. I have a 7-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. This time of my life is not remote for me.
Yes.
I can't quite, I'm really genuinely trying. I can't quite wrap my head around. I'm not saying it's impossible.
I would love to see a scene reenactment. Let's just say that.
Which is something that the police do. We don't know sort of the outcome of that.
Well, they do sometimes. They don't. Okay. I have yet to see law enforcement set up where the 2-year-old's there, for example, like this story. And, I don't know, she's talking about the 2-year-old like they can talk and things, so fine. Here, come out of your bedroom, do whatever you did, and climb in the bassinet. Let's see you do it. Because I think that's fairly far-fetched, especially with the rest of the story. Maybe if the bassinet is like right up against a couch and the 2-year-old climbs up there, and, bassinets are not the most stable structure. So, a big kid like that, that's why you can't put a 6 or 8 or 10-month-old in a bassinet, because if they move in the wrong way, the thing's going to flip over. So a 2-year-old is way bigger than a 6-month-old. So how the heck did that 2-year-old get up in there? Presumably there's no noise. She hears the thud is the thing that finally wakes her up. And then she supposedly, awakens to this scene. Well, to me, it doesn't make any sense. And then she throws in that the baby's onesie was undone and the diaper was off. So this is all going on while she's still sleeping or something. I mean, I find it interesting that the people who are sort of her champions present this as like, oh, this is the story. Doesn't that seem plausible? And to me, sorry, it doesn't seem plausible.
Yeah, and I think the point about the bassinet possibly being close to the couch is, I'm just thinking of like when my babies were really little and I did have them in bassinets so that they could sort of sleep right by me, and you can, and like also usually notably bassinets have high sides so that the baby can't roll out. So then you would also have to have, because she didn't say the bassinet was tipped over. Right. She said that the baby was on the floor and the 2-year-old was in the bassinet. So then
we got the scenario where the 2-year-old chucked the baby out,
picked it up and tossed it out. I mean,
yeah. Again, didn't hear anything happening until all of a sudden the baby's on the floor.
As you can probably hear, I'm kind of twisting my brain into a pretzel trying to give this story a fair shake. I'm also trying not to see this admittedly bizarre story through the lens of what else I know about Amanda, because this wasn't the first one of Amanda's children to end up in the hospital with a suspicious injury. According to Serial, Amanda left the father of her first child after he was indicated for abusive head trauma of their 1-month-old baby. And then there was an incident with the father of her other 4 children. Yanni Castillo pled no contest to aggravated assault of a child in 2019 after a police investigation determined that his then 2-month-old daughter's broken arm was a result of abuse. According to court records, Castillo told doctors and investigators a shifting story about how his daughter's arm broke. Initially, he said he woke up and heard the child screaming and found her with her arm dangling behind her back. His subsequent actions were also highly concerning. When asked why he drove his daughter to the hospital rather than calling an ambulance, he told them that he thought it would be quicker. However, records from the investigation show that Castillo sent a text message about the child's injury at 1:20 p.m. on December 5, 2017, but didn't arrive at the hospital until 5:30 p.m., more than 4 hours later. Records say Castillo took a polygraph test and admitted he was responsible for breaking the baby's arm. He eventually dropped the story that he simply found his daughter with her arm dangling and told the police he was changing the baby's diaper when he, quote, turned her the wrong way and heard a, quote, pop and snap sound. Serial presents this highly suspicious series of events like this, quote, Yanni lied at first, but finally admitted that he'd been changing the baby's diaper when her arm got caught behind her as he rolled her from one side to the other. An X-ray showed a fracture, which can happen like that by accident. But a child abuse pediatrician believed the injury was indicative of abuse. Yanni denied he'd hurt her on purpose, but eventually pled no contest to aggravated assault. End quote. So, can such an injury happen, quote, like that by accident? Not really, no. As news reports recount, Dr. Jenssen explained to investigators that babies' bones are extremely flexible, and it's harder, not easier, for their bones to break than it is for older children or adults. With the caveat that I don't have the medical records in this case, there's peer-reviewed literature on the biomechanical implausibility of a baby's arm breaking from rolling or a diaper change. The elements of the shifting story and the delay in seeking care are also called out in the literature as being significant predictors of abusive injuries. And then there's just common sense. Babies' bones don't just snap while you're changing their diapers. And this seems like something you'd know if you'd encountered a human baby. And there was an entire police investigation and a criminal conviction, not just one doctor diagnosing abuse. And it all just begs the question of why Neary and Serial are bending over backwards to diminish this incident. We then get to the third child from this family to be hospitalized with injuries diagnosed as abusive, Amanda's youngest son. According to news reports, Saranovsky also changed her story about how this particular injury happened, telling the responding paramedics that she was out of the room when the incident happened, heard fussing and crying, and returned to find the baby on the floor. She later shifted her story to the one she told investigators, and then Serial, that she'd been asleep when it happened and was awakened by a thud, finding the baby on the floor. Serial doesn't include this detail about Amanda's shifting story, and they also leave out that according to a doctor who interviewed her other children, they allegedly made statements such as "Mommy is very bad" and "Mommy spanks me on my butt." One child reported being afraid of Saranovsky. So you may be wondering, how does Dyan Neary turn this series of events into a story about a mistaken diagnosis by Dr. Jenssen? According to Neary and according to her producer, she sent these, and I think what she sort of presents as a smoking gun with this case, right, is that she presented anonymized medical records to other child abuse pediatricians, and they said,
well, how about who was that? Especially if you're going to use that as the evidence that Dr. Jenssen isn't doing her job properly. I mean, you can't just throw out this anonymous kind of thing with that sort of consequence. I mean, she talked to Dr. Alexander. Did she send it all to him to take a look at it and see what he thought? I mean, I think a lot of times,
you have an extremely experienced child abuse pediatrician willing to go on the record with you. And she appears to have not that aired anyway, asked him a single question about Munchausen by proxy abuse, which they, despite their protestations, spent a third of the show talking about. Seems maybe like there would be a good question in there. And yeah, I mean, I don't believe that they mention having asked him specifically about this case, which feels like a missed opportunity.
Right. And, I think one of the things that I found in some of the media reports about me was that they did actually quote child abuse pediatrician or two in some of the articles. But I would really challenge, what question exactly did you ask? There was one thing where, there was this accusation that I always came barging in and never introduced myself and was basically rude to people all the time and things like that. And they asked a child abuse pediatrician, well, should you introduce yourself? Oh, yes, I always do that. And then they switch it around as
if, that's a really good, I actually remember the exact quote you're talking about. So this was in Daphne Chen's USA Today piece called Bad Medicine. And she asked Dr. Jill Glick from Chicago, who we've also had on the show. She posed a question to her that was something along the lines of, what would you think if a doctor barged in and didn't introduce themselves and she said, well, that would be bad. I mean, I wouldn't support that. That would be bad medicine.
Right.
And yet there's no evidence that you did those things. Right. And they nonetheless used bad medicine as the pull quote for the whole thing. So I do think that that's we sort of know. And that was one of my questions was, well, what did you ask them? And I was really surprised, having talked to a number of child abuse pediatricians and many doctors for this show, The quotes that sort of like are not direct quotes, but the answers that Neary's referring to, where she said, well, the other child abuse pediatricians didn't, think this was abuse. They said they would have qualified, said this was an accident. And I was like, that to me seemed really surprising, because I can't imagine a child abuse pediatrician saying something like that based on only anonymized medical records, because that's not the protocol for diagnosing abusive head trauma. The chief piece of evidence Neary presents to cast doubt on Dr. Jenssen and Dr. Doshi's abuse diagnosis is that several other doctors, whom Neary presented with anonymized medical records, disagreed with it. However, these doctors are unnamed, and that's important because if you have the time and resources, you can find a doctor to say any case is not abuse. There's an entire cottage industry devoted to this. It's a well-known issue in the field, and we have a lot of reporting coming up on this in our upcoming season. I shared the near fatality report matching this case, which gave an overview of the baby's injuries, with Sally and asked for her interpretation.
Well, the child had skull fractures on both sides of the head. When you land on the head, you can get a skull fracture, but it's not on the other side of the head. It's on the side that you land on. Had subgaleal hemorrhage, so hemorrhage under the scalp. That's a hard enough impact to the head that you have a lump of blood over the fractures, and a layer of blood all over the brain. I think subarachnoid hemorrhage as well. Anyway, there's all these things. Well, we know one of the things that is very important, an important lesson that we learn in child abuse pediatrics, is you have to be able to figure out what things are reasonably explained by the accidental history that's presented and what things are not. So if this baby had come to the hospital and there was a linear fracture on one side of the head with a bump over it and a little blood under it, given the scenario, I would say not only would Dr. Jenssen have not concluded that it was child abuse, but the hospital wouldn't have called it in the first place. But the medical findings, all the science of it, does not make any sense for that explanation. It's much too extensive of injuries for, okay, fine, you don't want your 2-year-old to chuck your 7-week-old out of the bassinet, but kids don't die from that. Kids don't get hemorrhage all over their brain. They don't get like numerous skull fractures from that kind of an accidental scenario. Things like that happen, but they don't cause the medical findings that were there. So either they didn't send all of the medical findings to the child abuse pediatrician, whoever it was, and so they didn't have the full context to make any kind of statement about whether Dr. Jenssen made a correct decision or not in diagnosing child abuse. They also, I guess you're back to what question did you ask? Because, it just doesn't really make any sense that a child abuse pediatrician who really had the facts would say anything other than, that looks pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah. And they were similarly asking these CAPs, apparently, from, context clues, if they would have recommended separating the children. And that's just, number one, that's not the specific job of CAPs. And, I think there are mileage may vary in how reports are written. You were talking about sort of, if you have a finding of abuse, that you're not afraid to advocate for those children to be in a safe home, but you're not the entity that makes custody decisions. And, there was a history of abuse with this family. And so right. If they were being presented anonymized medical records, presumably they are not telling the CAPs that they're asking about that history of abuse or the issues with the story.
Left out anything about the risk factors. I guess it's possible that a young child abuse pediatrician who had very limited exposure to serious cases like bad head injuries might not have the experience and to a certain extent the expertise to look at full information and come to the right conclusion. But I think that's highly unlikely that was the problem, just because, I feel like the only thing that makes any sense to me is the person did not have the information that they needed to answer the question, or they might have said that about some completely different scenario.
Amanda tells Neary a really heart-wrenching story about her years of trying to get custody of her son back, a battle which at the end of the series appears to be ongoing. And it is a heart-wrenching story. News reports about Amanda's arrest show a mom who was really struggling at the time of her baby's removal. According to local news coverage, Amanda reported struggling with PTSD and postpartum depression. The article describes how police uncovered phone records about Amanda struggling to feed her children, especially with a partner in prison, and allude to possible issues with substance abuse. It's clear that Amanda needed some help, and our current system often isn't great at providing that help. This story is tragic. I just don't believe that the tragedy is a false allegation of abuse. And no matter what you think happened here, absolutely none of this will be helped by giving Amanda a platform to share her extremely dubious story that actually the injuries her baby sustained were her daughter's fault. This situation with Amanda and her children, that really I found very unnerving, specifically because, in this third episode, when they're talking to Amanda repeatedly reinforces the story that her 2-year-old child, who's now 6 or 7, did this. And that's clearly a story that child has been told. And right. She says that the child is suffering because of it. She says that she's having these behavioral issues, and she says that, the child feels like it was her fault that their baby brother got taken away. And that's
because Amanda has told her that 25 times.
Right. Because a 2-year-old is not going, let's say for the sake of argument that this story is completely true, and that child, when she was 2, did toss the baby out of the bassinet somehow. Nonetheless, that's not something that they would remember contextually right. on their own. And so I really that really sat wrong with me that the podcast is reinforcing that idea, which is clearly harmful to the child. I have a lot of questions about Amanda's motives for doing this, but also just I think the journalist, the journalists who are working on this, did you not think that, and I think they could have told this story. Again, this is an editorial choice. They could have told this story in such a way that it did not so directly place blame on a 6-year-old right. child.
They certainly could have left out Amanda's several statements, I believe, that it was her 2-year-old daughter's fault and she was suffering because of that. Because, the interesting thing is, so this 2-year-old, she's got some behavior problems. Obviously I'm somewhat speculating, but children who are in scenarios where they suffer adverse childhood experiences, so violence in the home, a lot of other things, but particularly violence in the home, are at high risk for mental health problems. And, a 2-year-old in that whole scenario, especially who is being told that this, it's not your fault, but it was your fault. That is really irresponsible, and in my view, somewhat emotionally abusive on the part of her mother. And then for multiple journalists and their editors and some supervisory people to all fail to consider, the adverse effect on that little child and other similar little children who get thrown under the bus by somebody. I was kind of stunned that I was hearing that and trying to act like, I think the child's been back with the mom for over a year now or something. And hey, take her to the counselor. If you're that concerned about, what's happening, I can't imagine some therapist that told the mom, hey, keep talking to her about it was her fault that her brother got hurt, and don't worry, mommy's trying to fight this in the media or in court or whatever. That's not a thing. So.
No, no. It's, and again, I think I just have such a direct, my daughter is that age, and I can't imagine like, I can't imagine not trying to protect her from in that situation, even if it did happen, right? Like, even if that was the truth, like, I just wouldn't throw my kid under the bus like that. I want to dig into the near fatality report that Serial mentions in this case. Neary frames this as a puzzling overreaction by Doshi and Jensen, saying that when she showed the anonymized medical records to a series of unnamed doctors, quote, all 3 doctors independently puzzled over the fact that Dr. Doshi and Dr. Jensen had certified the case as a, quote, near fatality, meaning the baby was in serious or critical condition, end quote.
That's the important thing, is that language is something under Pennsylvania law that requires one of these multidisciplinary meetings. We have that in Florida as well, where the legislature actually passed specific diagnoses even, but also seriousness of injury and things like that, where a child protective investigator can't complete their case without presenting it to experts such as would be at a child protection team. And, so there's some equivalent process with Pennsylvania where if you have a child that's hospitalized, in Florida, that's one of the criteria that requires a referral to the child protection team for a medical director or one of their colleagues to evaluate the case and assess, because there's, complicated medical information that somebody with a social work degree may not appreciate the nuances of. And you need someone who is expert to make sure that that is appropriately assessed, and then either that abuse is ruled out or that it is understood that this is a scenario where the child's safety is significantly at risk, and this was a fairly serious injury. That must just be the language in the statute in Pennsylvania that talks about that near fatality.
Right, but this isn't just, again, like an independent sort of doctor puts it in the system that way. It sounds like there is some process to this, which we can definitely kind of look into.
Right. It looked like from some of the documents that as additional severity of brain injury were identified, that the case fell into a near fatality criteria, and they then followed their path to review the case and that kind of thing.
Under Pennsylvania law, a near fatality is not something a child abuse pediatrician personally just declares. It's a statutory classification that's triggered when a physician certifies that a child is in serious or critical condition as a result of abuse. And the brain injuries documented in this case, bilateral skull fractures, multiple intracranial hemorrhages, shearing and bridging vein injuries, and findings consistent with violent rotational acceleration-deceleration forces, qualify it. Once those injuries were identified, the county was legally required to classify the case as a near fatality and convene a state-mandated Act 33 review. So this is a mandated legal process, not evidence of a crusading child abuse pediatrician. I also found it interesting that the near fatality report cites the strength of the hospital's coordination with the agency, writing, "Of particular note in this case was the provision of images from the child's scans and clear explanations of them. It also notes that, quote, the family was receiving in-home services when this incident occurred. There was a lack of follow-through with the family for ongoing face-to-face contacts and verification of compliance with treatment providers," end quote. As seems to always be the case in these media stories, the more information you learn about a case like Amanda Saranovsky's, the less it seems to fit with Neary's description of it as an example of, quote, the cases where doctors and caseworkers are making judgment calls about events obscured by a giant question mark because the only witness is a small child. And for Sally, this just feels like deja vu.
It felt familiar, let's say that, in terms of just what was presented, and sort of with great umbrage of, look at what is happening to children and their families and things, and like no actual objective information presented that would provide evidence that you're saying something valid. I mean, it just, I've actually tried to, pursue like some defamation liability, assistance in my own case. And it's disturbing to me that the laws in terms of defamation and libel remain fairly limited, and I think go back to decades ago when there was limited media available, newspapers, magazines, network news, things like that. And there's sort of this idea that there was some integrity of the system where they're not going to present information to the public that, doesn't have any evidence to support it. And now, with all the different ways that things get put out into the public now, I mean, still the New York Times, New York Magazine, they have a responsibility here, but they don't appear to have much liability for just letting this stuff get thrown out there. And I mean, it's really unfortunate. And child abuse pediatricians are among, I'm not saying doctors aren't well paid or anything like that, but child abuse pediatricians are kind of in the bottom rungs of physician income. And personally, I certainly couldn't afford to pay millions of dollars to some attorney to try to get some, vindication or justice or something about this. And the idea that people in the media and attorneys, for that matter, Greg Anderson, the one that Alley Law, whatever that was. These people can apparently just say anything they want with no evidence to back it up, and there's nothing you can do about it.
And this brings me back to my original question for Serial. What exactly is the point of all this? There are changes we could make that are well studied and supported that would greatly impact families like Amanda's for the better. No mom should be struggling on her own with 5 kids the way Amanda was. I'm not absolving her of responsibility for what she may have done to her child, but I am saying that it's very possible this whole thing was avoidable. We know this from prevention research. But child abuse pediatricians step in when it's already too late to prevent the harm. It is, unfortunately, a necessary role. And what's not going to help any families at all is driving child abuse pediatricians out of their jobs. It will only mean that these decisions will be made by less qualified people, meaning more errors on both ends, more children being harmed, and more children being removed unnecessarily. It also leaves more room for grifters, anti-vaxxers, child abuse deniers, and people who, quote, do their own research to be taken more seriously than experts working from robust science. I wonder if there's you sort of connect some dots for us that I've really been acutely aware of it's really interesting to see sort of this story, how it was being told in 2023 versus now. In the year of our RFK Jr. 2025, as you were saying, like, child abuse pediatricians are doctors and they follow science and they have standards of care and all these things, right? Even if they're treated like these sort of boogie men, well, really boogie women, because it really is
mostly
a lot
women.
focused on
Yep.
women. Which like we could dig into the misogyny of that another time. But, even though they're presented as boogie women who are, just so overzealous in their jobs and so overly sure of themselves and so arrogant that they're snatching up babies, that's just not really connected to reality. And
you sort of touched on it previously in terms of the child abuse pediatrician is in somewhat of a different role as far as, it's not a thing typically for doctors when you make the correct diagnosis that family members, attack and hate you. I think So that's a little different, but I think that there is a problem in the country where, not believing doctors, not believing science, not looking objectively at history and history of illnesses and all kinds of other medical components is really problematic for both adults and children. I think that on the one hand, I don't necessarily have a problem with scrutiny of the medical profession and actual identification of scenarios in which somebody is not practicing good medicine or is putting people in danger or, things like that. I mean, I think there's a pretty robust system for how you deal with that in the medical profession. And to sort of portray that academies of pediatrics, for example, or internal medicine, guidelines that they develop, criteria that they develop, consensus opinions that are put out, recommendations about vaccines or medications or management of blood pressure or management of pregnancy, or all different kinds of medical issues that, there certainly needs to be integrity in that scenario, but it's not good for anybody if it's presented as if 98% of internal medicine physicians and their governing bodies, academies, etc., making a certain recommendation for something, portraying that it's reasonable that they're a bunch of quacks. It just doesn't really pass muster to me. It's one thing. I mean, honestly, Dr. Kirkpatrick, Dr. Hanna, those are the people that somebody should be talking about, that they are far outside of, what's considered reasonable practice of medicine, and have been far outside for years and apparently are still at it. The idea that those doctors are not criticized in any way, but people who are following guidelines and protocols and doing thorough objective work and having data behind opinions that they present and things like that. I mean, they're not apples to apples. I mean, we don't want to have a scenario where the media gets people thinking that most doctors are whatever, some long list of bad things, and so we shouldn't trust them. And with any kind of medical recommendations or diagnoses or things like that. I mean, that sends this society into a fairly dark place.
What would you like to say to journalists that are possibly embarking on reporting on some of these stories, and also people who are absorbing that journalism who may not have had those experiences in their life where they realize sort of what the stakes are?
Well, in one county in Florida, we provided 1,200 medical evaluations a year for children where there were allegations of abuse and neglect. And that was about 10% of the reports to the hotline that came for Pinellas County, just our county. So I've seen this in criminal trials, jury scenarios, attorneys for that matter, I think, judges. I think across the board in this country, people, I think, like to think that child abuse is not common. And very sadly, for the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of children every year who end up in the hospital from physical abuse, or who have very serious psychological problems and even medical problems as a result of experiencing Munchausen syndrome by proxy, children who are constantly exposed to violence in their in their household and adverse experiences and things. And there's putting your head in the sand and pretending that that's not a thing. I mean, I get it. Maybe in your child's third grade class, nobody got reported to the hotline this year. But that doesn't mean that it's not a serious problem all over the country that goes on and on and on, multi-generational abuse that has been happening for decades, and serious injuries to children in both, physical and mental capacities. People who are writing these kinds of articles, especially that don't seem to approach it with any real integrity or sense of fairness or balance or anything, you're not hurting me. I mean, it's inconvenient to have people blowing up my cell phone, but you're not hurting me. You're hurting little children because you're portraying to the public that there's witch hunts going on all over the place and parents don't abuse their children. Well, that's not the case. And somebody needs to stand up for these children. And I don't apologize for choosing to do that.
Dr. Sally Smith is a tough lady, and she's kind of understating what she's been through here. I got a little taste of it when she was on my show the first time. This was a series that brought out some of the most vitriolic comments I've ever received, as well as my very first death threats. And while these things are unpleasant, she's right. The people waging this war on CAPS may be hurting the doctors they're attacking as well, but vulnerable, voiceless children will pay the real price. But the voices of victims and abuse survivors weren't the only things left out of Serial's coverage.
If I thought Jensen was wrong, I would have told her in a flash. I had no problem with that. And she would have had no problem in receiving that information. She might, want to argue or discuss the case, so that'd be fine. That's what you do as medical professionals, but it never happened.
That's next time on Nobody Should Believe Me. Nobody Should Believe Me is produced and hosted by me, Andrea Dunlop. Our editor is Greta Stromquist, and our senior producer is Mariah Gossett. Research and fact-checking by Aaron Ajayi, administrative support from Nola Carmouche.